Hello, and welcome to my second PlayStation Plus review, where this week I'm discussing the generous October offering of Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain. Now, before I get into the actual game, I think a potential indication here from Sony is that after mentioning this price hike, if you can call it a price hike, a couple of months ago, they're opting to up the weight of their offerings, I think, when it comes to their monthly games, and it tends to have people kind of split right down the middle. I mean, I know people at work that always kind of moan that we get these indie titles that they've never heard of, and they're paying for this kind of yearly subscription, which may well have been a complaint across the board because this month we have Metal Gear Solid 5 and Amnesia, and that's off the back of previous months where we've had games such as Life is Strange, Until Dawn. So I'm interested to know whether this kind of dirty protest of everyone turning off auto-renewal has actually coaxed Sony into, offering us a better calibre of game. Or perhaps maybe whether they were intending to offer us better games in the first place, and that is actually the reason for the price hike. Maybe they need to pay licenses for these titles. I'm not sure, but I just found it quite an interesting subject to kind of start off with, because I have noticed this kind of upswing of the actual games they're offering. So, for a little bit of context going into The Phantom Pain, I am a legacy Metal Gear Solid fan. I played from Metal Gear Solid, the original PlayStation 1 installment, right up to Metal Gear Solid 4. I dabbled in Covert Ops, I think it was called, for the PSP. And then I basically kind of went off grid for a while. I've played the original titles on emulators as well. And the reason that I kind of went off grid and kind of departed from the series, I suppose, for a while was because I kept reading reports and interviews that Hideo Kojima, the director and creator, was no longer invested in the series. And there's a popular idea that actually, around the time of Metal Gear Solid 2, The Sons of Liberty, he was actually getting quite bored of the series and he wanted to kind of wrap it up. And I'm not sure, the extent to which that is true. And obviously we know now that he had been having issues with Konami because, of course, he no longer works there. But this kind of made me a bit more detached from the series. The reason being is that I absolutely love the story. I love the convoluted characters and story arcs that kind of go on in the Metal Gear Solid universe. And I was worried that I might end up playing these games that are quite lackluster because his heart just wasn't in it anymore, and the team's heart perhaps wasn't in it anymore, and it was being governed more by Konami than it was by Kojima. So, turning to The Phantom Pain as my monthly download, my main handicap going into it is that I have missed Metal Gear Solid Ground Zeroes, which precedes the events of the game, and how we find Snake at the beginning of Phantom Pain is very much how, not immediately how Ground Zeroes ended, but it's a direct sequel to the events of Ground Zeroes. So, although I do have that handicap of not knowing immediately what preceded the game, I have enough to go on. I've read a couple of wiki pages, and I know enough. And the interesting thing about Phantom Pain is it's really starting to bridge the events of the first Metal Gear game, and also the Shadow Moses incident, which was, of course, the scenario for Metal Gear Solid 1. So, there's kind of story arcs and characters emerging here that I'm actually really quite familiar with, and I didn't find myself kind of lost in the wilderness too much when it comes to the story. And I think anyone familiar with Metal Gear as a series will find it very much the same. So, true to form, the game opens with a cinematic introduction of convoluted "where am I, who am I?" and this kind of convolution of what's going on. You're completely divorced from what's going on. And there is quite a neat David Bowie soundtrack playing in the background as well. But we find Snake hospitalized, and he's missing an arm, which is one of the smaller allusions to the title of Phantom Pain, which actually has a wider meaning. But this traumatic opening of him discovering he has no arm is followed by an onboarding process to the controls, which are really quite different and really quite convoluted. And I've been playing this game for a couple of weeks now, and I'm still kind of fumbling when it comes to changing weapons and doing certain things, because there's so much, and they use the full spectrum of the PS4 gamepad as well, which is cool because you can do so much more, but also coming off the back of Metal Gear Solid 4, there's so much more offered up in this game that it takes a while to get used to, even after the onboarding of the escape from the hospital mission. And once again, with this kind of escape from the hospital, Kojima doesn't shy from putting the player through some agonizingly slow, cruel sequences and prolonged scenarios for the sake of realism, as well as onboarding, which we kind of come to expect from the series now, really. And of course, we're introduced to some of the roster of kind of supernatural freaks which are sandwiched between the kind of pseudo-political wartime story arc which has prevailed since the series began as well, which is awesome. For my part, just digressing on this, I love how the bizarre Black Ops fiction of Metal Gear as a series is weaved into these real-world events, such as the Cold War, such as the Soviet-Afghan War, and how these wartime narrative kind of coalesce to create something that we actually can suspend our disbelief for to some extent, because they're based around real world events. But I have found in some instances that these things get too overblown for my brain capacity, particularly when we're looking at the post-apocalypse kind of PMC world of Metal Gear Solid 4 and all that nanomachine stuff. I don't quite grasp all of that. But what carries the Metal Gear universe forward for me is this core cast of characters, which we were introduced to very early on as well. Spoiler alert, but Revolver Ocelot is there, Master Miller is there. So Metal Gear Solid 5 kind of continues this lineage with noted characters and noted story arcs kind of being bridged. But to try and keep this relatively spoiler-free and down to a reasonable length, I'm not going to delve into the characters or context, as that is a whole kind of can of worms that warrants its own series of videos, I think. But I'll simply note that Metal Gear Solid 5 takes place, as I've noted, during the Soviet-Afghan War, and it operates in equal parts as a cinematic marvel and this kind of convoluted gameplay espionage action. I believe the subline for the game is tactical espionage action, which is slightly different from earlier games because it has a lot more focus now on tactics and of course action as well. Which comes to the key turning point, I suppose, for the series and this game. It is a free-roaming, gameplay-heavy, choose-your-approach sort of game. The cinematic and linear gameplay is really stripped quite back. You no longer feel that you're playing a interactive movie, which is obviously a kind of it's a hallmark of the Metal Gear series, really. But the Phantom Pain is much more of an action game. It's much more of an open world RPG almost sort of game, and it has this customization. You have your own base. You kind of recruit people. You customize things. You develop weapons. All of this sort of stuff is absolutely insane. How much it's changed since Metal Gear Solid 4, which was the last installment I played. I'm fully aware that a lot of this was introduced in Ground Zeroes, but it's just a far cry from the Metal Gear sort of games that we are familiar with, and I'm genuinely interested to know if this has actually turned any traditional Metal Gear fans away from the series. I personally quite like it, but it's certainly very different in terms of a gameplay approach. And on this note, I think actually the gameplay is a lot more difficult than earlier games as well. I mean, for Metal Gear Solid and Metal Gear Solid 2, to a lesser extent Snake Eater, but not really Snake Eater, you can actually play the game just by looking at the little radar in the corner. That's no longer the case. You need to manually kind of identify your enemies. You need to identify pain points and routes through certain outposts and missions and things like that, which is, it's a very interesting way of doing things, and I think it's a kind of breath of fresh air, because I think it goes without saying, certainly Metal Gear Solid and Metal Gear Solid 2 are actually pretty easy games to complete, even on their kind of harder modes. The intelligence of the enemies has also improved somewhat, and the maps are really thrown open again for us to kind of pursue the sort of adventure that we want. You get to ride a horse as well, which is pretty cool right from the outset. And on this note, I would actually argue that the mechanics of riding a horse and gameplay on a horseback is much better than Red Dead Redemption. And I think that's interesting to note, because Red Dead Redemption, it kind of dines out on the fact you ride horses. It's a Rockstar game that takes place in the American West, but it's actually quite cumbersome to use the horse and kind of maneuver yourself and use weapons on horseback, but Metal Gear Solid 5 makes that actually really quite an easy thing to do. So kudos for them for really upping the game and blowing Rockstar out of the water with that, I think. So just to wrap up, because my PS Plus reviews are supposed to be very condensed, small overviews, I totally recommend this game to people that have played Metal Gear Solid, any of the series kind of in the past. But in some ways I think it's a very interesting and weird choice for Sony to make a free monthly download, because if you're coming to this game fresh, if you're downloading it having never played a Metal Gear game, you're really not going to grasp much, if anything, of what's going on. So it's quite a strange choice for a monthly download. And the alternative you have, I believe, is the Amnesia series, which I haven't personally played. I've downloaded them and I'm gonna give them a go. I'm a bit of a puss when it comes to horror, but you know, I got through Until Dawn, so we'll see how that goes. But anyway, for anyone that didn't bother picking up Metal Gear Solid 5 like myself, but is a fan of the series, this is definitely a worthwhile game to play, and it's a very unique installment to the Metal Gear series to date. I believe that it is actually coming full circle now. I'm not sure if they're going to explore the Big Boss story arc any further, but in terms of the story and the gameplay, yeah, I'd totally recommend it if you haven't already.